Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. In the spirit of the trees, in the spirit of living nature of which we are a part, with deep gratitude to all the generations before us, which have brought us to the present moment in time. I want to welcome all of you to this session of Humanity Rising as we embark on a 5-day program looking at the crisis and challenge of democracy in the United States. Today is a federal holiday. It's celebrating for the first time June 19th, called Juneteenth, which commemorates that day back in 1865, when the last of slaves in the United States were freed near Galveston, Texas. We're also meeting at a time when the January 6th Special Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives is about halfway through public hearings that are demonstrating incontrovertibly that Donald Trump engaged in an attempted coup, a coup that is still going on as Donald Trump and the Republican Party continue to undermine democratic institutions and the democratic right to vote in this country. So as we gather together today, we're mindful that the midterms coming up in November are critical, not only for immediate issues having to do with the economy and war and peace, but having more fundamentally to do with the viability of democracy itself in a country that for 246 years has been governed by democratic principles and democratic processes. We're mindful that the challenge to democracy, as acute as it is in the United States, is a global phenomenon. We are aware that all over the world, there's a rising tide of authoritarianism as democratic societies and democratic structures, the freedom of the press, the freedom of movement, and free speech is increasingly being curtailed in country after country. So we are wanting at Humanity Rising, as we've done a number of times before, to bring programs like we will be airing this week of critical importance for humanity to consider at this moment in the human journey, where so much is at stake. And whether it's climate change or war and peace or economics, nothing that we would like to solve as a human community will be solved unless democracy flourishes and is protected. So that's what we're going to be contemplating over the next 5 days. This is the third in a series of 5-day programs. But before we dive in, let us pause, as we always do as we begin our sessions, and just take a moment to center yourself in your body. Your body is nature. We're all nature embodied. And close your eyes if you can, and place your attention on your heart for the next minute. Just attune yourself with your heart in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that we're all alive together as community at this extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our conveners for the week. George Caponelli, you know, who's the founder of Age Nation and the chief executive officer of Age Nation. He's passionate about democracy and what he calls the power of one. Also want to welcome John Steiner, who with his wife, Margot King, is I'd say our networkers par excellence, and also very passionate about preserving democracy here in the United States, with a particular focus on the midterm elections coming up in November. So George and John, I turn the program over to you with deep thanks for everything you've done to support Humanity Rising, and more fundamentally, for what you're doing to animate the public to preserve democracy as we know it in America.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you very much. And it's really a pleasure to be here. Well, I don't say it's a pleasure because we're all in an uphill climb. And the consequences that Jim spoke to, I know are critical for John Steiner and I, and Margot King, who's not with us today, but has played a critical role in bringing these programs together. We have an extraordinary week ahead. Authors, activists, experts, and candidates who are all committed to dealing with this current threat to our democracy, which none of us can underestimate its consequence or its long-term importance to all of us. Because not only, as Jim said, does it threaten democracy, but it threatens humanity itself. It threatens the other species. It threatens our precious habitat, because the progress that we can make will be derailed in, 146 days or whatever it is between now and the midterms. We need to get up on our hind legs and howl at the moon and let the moon know that we're not going to give up the ship. And for any of you out there that are saying, well, what the hell, it's the midterms and I'm going to wait for 2024 to really get involved, I can tell you that if we do not save democracy in 2022, the chance of doing much in 2024 is going to be severely limited and maybe impossible. These folks who are out to destroy democracy are not playing games, and neither should we. So I just want to say a couple of more things. One, a lot of us have marched and got excited and enthused and engaged in a number of individual issues. But a lot of people recognize that for some reason or another, people don't march for democracy. They march for a sub-issue of some kind that they can get their hands on. And so I want to share a quote with you by John Lewis, who says, "Democracy is not a state, it's an act. And each generation must do its part to help build what we call the beloved community, a nation and world society at peace with itself." So that's our job. And as we go through this week, I ask you to keep asking yourself, am I really committed to saving democracy? What am I prepared to do? How am I prepared to do it? And do I recognize that what I do could very well determine the well-being of those I love, of my own life in general, and of this community called America? So with that, John, I invite you to start us off, please.
Thank you, George. And George and Jim, thank you for your usual good framing comments today. And George, the only thing I want to add to what you said is, at one level, we all love our country. And as a friend pointed out again, I think I heard it this morning, love is action. Really loving something is acting. So that's, I think, a good footnote or postscript to what you said today. Most of how we're spending our time in these last few weeks and this week, and probably one or two more before the elections, is really focusing on November. But what's exciting about today, and a little paid political announcement I want to offer before we introduce our panelists, is that we're also involved in the long game. And a lot of what we're going to hear today is about young leaders who not just care about the country and a party, but care about democracy as a whole. And how do we really bridge political divides to get stuff done? And one of the people, George, that you and Mark Gerzon had on a few months back, and we'll have on again tomorrow, is a young man named Stephen Olakara. At 22, he founded an organization called the Millennial Action Project, bringing young leaders of Congress and in 30 states together across political divides to get stuff done. And he's now running as truly a long shot candidate for the United States Senate in Wisconsin. By June 30th, in order to qualify to be on the debate stage in July, he needs 5,000 donations from people, I think, either within the state or anywhere around the country. And I'm putting out a pitch with George that if you're so moved, go to StephenOlakara.com. That's StephenOlakara.com. And Stan, if you could put that in the chat, and you can give him $1. And believe us, Stephen needs to be on the debate stage. He's a young leader in our country. He's a long-term leader, and he cares about bringing us all together. So thank you for that. We'll hear more from Stephen tomorrow. And it's really my privilege this morning to introduce a young friend who, Zach, I think I met you when you were still in high school or just out of high school. This is Zach Malamed. You founded and directed for some years an organization that you started called the Student Voice, where you organized high school students to advocate for equity in education. We then got to work together when you were at Facebook, helping it implement and strategize really about Facebook's first civic education initiative, where you allocated or helped to allocate $1 million to support global youth leaders, one of whom was a young woman named Clara Nevins, who had started a bridging organization for high school students that you were able to help get some money for and made a difference. But why you're here today and why we're introducing you to our audience is that our friend Zach here is the co-founder and executive director of a young organization, a few years old, we'll hear more about it, called the Next 50, which is committed to supporting 50 young candidates and organizers in swing districts and in states every 2 years. So Zach, welcome. It's a delight to have you, and I'm going to ask you to introduce our other panelists with whom you're working very closely, Ramon Contreras.
Thank you, John, and thank you, George, and thank you, everybody, for having us. Before I introduce Ramon, John, I just want to say, I remember when we met, I think the year was about 2017, 2018, and I walk into this room of civic leaders and organizers with a good deal more experience than I had, let's put it that way. And I don't think many people really looked at me or would give me the time of day. And I remember being in this room, and it was as if nobody else was in the room. You would focus on me, talk to me, introduce me to folks. And I think that power and value of that power in valuing young people is what opens up a lot of doors and helps people like me do the work that I'm doing today. So thank you for that. It's something that I hope to be able to pay forward soon. With that, I have the great privilege of introducing Ramon Contreras, a friend and colleague of mine who got started in this work. I got started in education organizing. Ramon, through very personal experience, got involved through gun violence prevention work. He co-founded Youth Over Guns in New York City. an organization aimed at combating gun violence in Black and brown communities and educating children on the danger of guns. This is an issue that today is quite prevalent in our national dialogue, but also hits close to home with Ramon and myself, having both lost friends to gun violence at a young age. Later on, he joined March for Our Lives as a national field strategist, traveling over to 60 cities across the United States, mobilizing young voters to the polls for the 2018 elections. Ramon and I had the privilege of doing a lot of work around the 2020 campaign together, and now he serves as an advisor to the Next 50's work. So thank you, Ramon, for joining and for the work you've done.
Well, Zach and Ramon both, we're really delighted to have you here. And, one of the things we want to stress today is not only what the issues and challenges are, but what viewers can do specifically across the board in making a difference in the midterms and beyond. Because my hope and prayer certainly is that we're going to retain I know this is not a partisan program or a partisan dialogue, but the truth of the matter is we're looking to replace those elected officials and candidates who lack good faith in the well-being of America, no matter what party they're in. Unfortunately, at the moment, too many of them are in the Republican Party that seems to have lost its way. But that's a personal preference, and I own that and state that. But would you begin? I mean, John's done a wonderful job, as have you, Zach, in introducing Ramon. But where does the fire come from? Where's the fire come from that has led you to do what you do? What's that all about?
Should I go first, or Ramon?
Sure, please.
Sure. I was in second grade in September of 2001 when the towers came down, living in a suburb just outside of Manhattan. I actually remember both that day like it was yesterday, but also the day after. And I really want to focus on that day after because the ashes came over my town to the point where my mom almost didn't want to send me to school. But what I remember and what has moved me since was the work that my neighbors and family members did to help clean up in the days after. I remember the patriotic chants of USA, USA at sporting events that I attended afterward. But I'm most moved by the fact that in a moment of such darkness, so many people were inspired to do good, to service their communities. And as a young person, a 7-year-old at the time, I felt relative helplessness. And I committed myself then to making sure that should a moment like that arise again, that I would be in a position to be of service to my community. I fast forward to March of 2020, and the world was shutting down. And I remember actually, a brief moment. I remember my dad picking me up from school on September 11th. He had walked home from, for those who know New York, Madison Square Garden. He got picked up at Shea Stadium in Queens and driven home in a Tropicana truck. And then he came to school and picked me up and walked me home. And as he walked me home, he tried to help explain what was happening that day. And I actually only really fully processed what was happening by watching it on SportsCenter, because at the time I was a young sports fanatic, and I realized how the gravitas of the moment by watching it on a place where that usually would never highlight any of the news. And I fast forward now to March 2020, where I'm walking on the streets of New York as the city shutting down, and I see a father walking with his son, trying to explain what was happening in that moment as the world was transforming itself. And for me, and perhaps for that son, and for this next generation of folks who are being raised in this political moment, it's very easy to be trapped in a politics of fear. And it took me probably 10, 15 years to realize that a politics of fear was no way that I wanted to live. I wanted a politics of hope. I wanted to live a life of service. And we have an opportunity today. I think we're at a critical moment in our country and our democracy to be of service. And to help shape the direction that our country goes in, perhaps even our world goes in. for years to come. I could see no more important work to be doing. And I say to everybody, you know, I quit a job at Facebook where I had a comfortable salary, a comfortable life. If I had $1 billion right now, I'd do the work that I'm doing, because there's nothing to me that's more purposeful than investing in this next generation of leaders who I think will hopefully build a country around the politics of hope, a politics of aspiration. And so that gives me energy, just rising from the darkness and really recognizing there's a lot of opportunity ahead. And if we aren't working to build that future, someone else is, and it may not be the person that we want to be building that future. So we have an obligation to step up in this moment. And I know that's what I feel like is important for me to do. I have a responsibility to do. And I know Ramon, although with a different story, feels the same way.
Yeah, Ramon. Thank you, Zach. Go ahead, Ramon.
Yeah,
Question, George.
I hear that story a lot, Zach, and it's still inspiring when people with unique and moving stories come together for a cause like this. And I can imagine that multiple people here on this call have moving stories that drove them to action. But for me, it started with my parents when they immigrated to this country when they were teenagers, searching for the American dream, for opportunity. But then being met with that failed reality of what America was to its immigrants, to its working class people. I was born in the South Bronx, raised in Harlem in public housing. Had to grow up watching my mom work multiple jobs just to be able to provide for me and my two older sisters and ensure that we had the best opportunities possible in a community that was being deprived by resources. And when a community is deprived by resources, what we see is a community that has an increase in violence, sort of as of guns. We see a community where students don't have any economic opportunity to move forward, or don't even have a guidance counselor within their schools to be able to guide them through the education system that is now vital towards actually being a member of our society, right? And having a job that pays, that gives you healthcare. I grew up watching folks that didn't have healthcare, folks that couldn't afford their rent and ended up in the streets. For me, those were all examples of what I grew up with, but what really drove me to action was my senior year of high school, when all of these factors in my community impacted me personally, impacted me and my school and my community. I lost a friend to gun violence my senior year of high school. He was walking home from a party and he was shot and killed by an illegal handgun. And at a time when you think you're going to college with all your friends, you think you're going to prom with all your friends, you think that we're all gonna, walk the stage and graduate together, but instead we end up all gathering around a casket of a cold body of somebody who was our friend, who's our age, who we're supposed to grow up together with, changes you. And for me, that's what lit the fire in me. That's what made me promise in that moment that I would do everything I can to end gun violence in America. And everything I've done since then has been towards that promise. Creating a nonprofit called Youth Over Guns and gathering 10,000 people across the Brooklyn Bridge in New York as we carry a casket to symbolize the deaths in Black and Latino communities. Getting on the bus with March for Our Lives and Parkland survivors and survivors from all across the country to 60 cities, 35 states across the US, demanding that our elected officials do something about gun violence, urging young people to vote, registering them to vote. All of that has been through that promise that I believe America can become a place where not a single person has to be shot and killed, where students who are about to graduate high school don't have to face what I faced or what the Parkland students faced. And it's what drives me to do the work with Zach in the Next 50. All right, it's this diverse coalition of young people who, like you said, George, it isn't really about, one party or another. It's about supporting leaders, right, who have a good vision for America and who are doing the basic necessities to be able to keep Americans safe, keep Americans on track, and ensure that we are actually a country that's living up to its ideals. So that's what lit the fire under me. That's what keeps me going. And that's what I got for now. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you both. Yeah.
So Zach, tell us about the Next 50, how you came to start it, what you guys are doing. Ramon, obviously you can chime in here, but As far as we know, there's not a whole lot like this going on in our country right now. So give us a little context and background as well as presence.
You're still on mute.
You're muted, Jack. There you go.
I think what's important to recognize is that political power is not built overnight. And at the Next 50, we recognize that 50 years ago, conservatives came up with a plan to win. And by all measures, they've won. And they've won in large part by investing in their young people. In the years leading up to Trump, they spent 3 times as much, or 500 million more, investing in their young people, to the point where now in every election since 2008, where Trump's not been on the ballot, the share of young voters supporting conservatives has increased. The share, by the way, of Black voters supporting Republicans, conservatives, has increased. The share of Latino voters supporting conservatives has increased. And we only expect that to continue to increase because we have not made the proper investments in this next generation of leaders, of voters who share a diverse set of experiences, come from a diverse set of backgrounds, but are equal partners in leading our democracy forward. And so at the Next 50, we've made a commitment toward investing in 50 leaders every 2 years, primarily candidates, but sometimes organizers, filling necessary gaps in key states and serving key constituencies that often go underserved or underinvested in, because we recognize that in order for leaders to win elections, there also has to be infrastructure in place to support their leadership. And on the note about infrastructure, as we invest in this next generation of leadership, we're also thinking about what it means to cultivate the next generation of political donors, because we believe political giving is the highest impact form of philanthropy. When our government controls over $8.5 trillion in budget, that's money that can be used to help address hunger, address homelessness, improve our healthcare system, address the climate crisis that we're facing, address the gun violence endemic that we're facing in our country. The government has immense power, and if we elect the right leaders to allocate those resources effectively, we can have a transformative impact on our country. And so when we think about people giving money in the 2016 presidential election, of the percentage, in the year 2016, in terms of the percentage of philanthropic giving allocated towards politics, only 1 to 2% of US philanthropy in 2016 went towards political giving. Now, if you think about the outsized impact that election has had on our country, on our world, we could have spent a little bit more. We're not saying that political giving needs to be the majority of philanthropy, but we believe by electing the right leaders and investing in the right infrastructure, we could have a transformative impact on our country. And so at the Next 50, we're really thinking about what does it take to invest and build political power over the next 50 years by investing in those leaders, but also investing in the people and cultivating the people who can allocate the resources to ensuring the success of those leaders. Because any strong political movement needs to be backed by a healthy amount of resources. The conservatives did a really good job of building that infrastructure 50 years ago. And it's time for us to think about how we do that for this next era. And I'd love to discuss a little bit more about that in a moment. But Ramon, anything that you want to add there?
Zach, let me just ask before Ramon. Zach, for those who won't have a chat, what's your website that people can go to really look at who some of these leaders are?
The next50.us. I just put it in the, I realize I know message to host and panelists. I will send it to everyone right now. This is the website, the next50.us. We've already announced 28 of the leaders that we're backing this cycle. We'll soon, in the next couple of weeks, announce another 17 to 22 leaders, hopefully 22. Most of these leaders are running in swing districts and states. So when we back these leaders, they're not just great, promising young leaders. They're also running in some of the most consequential districts in the entire country that could help us build and sustain majorities, prevent supermajorities for anti-democratic parties or political interests. These are some of the most important races and some of the greatest leaders in the country, and they're helping us build the bench of talent that will ultimately run for higher office in some of these competitive races in some of the most consequential states across the country.
And Zach really hit all the right points. I just want to also mention that most of the candidates that the Next 50 backs are also candidates that aren't born into a fundraising network. right, are candidates who have the vision, right, who are political leaders and could be national leaders in this country, but just don't have the financial network or donor network to be able to make that possible. And those are the candidates that the Next 50 are looking for. Those are the candidates that the Next 50 supports. It is the leaders that will make our local governments and Congress more representative of the American people. And it's the ones that can relate when they're actually creating laws and voting on specific legislation that can actually come from what they're voting on. You know, we've seen in America for a long time that our state governments and legislative bodies don't usually reflect what people look like. And we're doing a better job at that now. But the Next 50, right, is going above and beyond and making sure that we're electing folks in the state level, on the city level, and those seats that, you know, the Democratic Party could be investing in, but aren't, right? And these seats don't just elect a person who has great potential, like Zach said. It also gives us a chance to be able to make a lot of momentum in flipping a district, flipping a state, and potentially investing in a young leader who could one day very much become the governor of a state or the senator of a state or even the president, right? It's about those early investments that create the next generation of leaders. And usually those leaders are leaders that aren't born, right, into this very abstract political donor giving network.
So Zach and Ramon, so if somebody A wants to give to the next50.us, I presume you go on the website and do so. But is there a way also, if a particular leader jumps out at a viewer, that person can direct their money to a particular person? How does it work? How are you guys working at that level?
On the political front, I just put a link in the chat for those who are able to give to American politics directly. Every single one of those dollars that you put into that link there goes directly to the leaders that we back. Not a single penny goes to any operational costs, any of that. This link goes directly to the leaders we back. Now, with that said, on our website, there are also links where you can choose to directly invest in the leaders themselves. For those who are not able to give to American politics, I'll work on getting you a link in a moment. There are ways to give directly to the leaders and to the organization's efforts to directly invest in those leaders too.
I want to, for those of you who are watching and listening, I want to stress something Zach said, that the conservatives began an initiative 50 years ago. In some ways, it actually began with a guy by the name of Lewis Powell, who was nominated by Nixon as an Associate Justice. And for those of you who don't know what Lewis Powell did, he created a blueprint that's available just by Googling the Powell Memorandum. He created this architecture that the party has followed with a dedication, as Zach indicated. They put their money where their mouth was, and they have actually since 1972 followed that blueprint with severe dedication. And so what we're facing today, thank you, Lewis Powell, is a result of that effort to buy textbook companies and direct the information there, to elect local leaders, to buy radio and television stations locally, also to create a 50-year plan to take over the U.S. court system, especially at its highest levels. So if you want to know what the work Zach and Ramon has the possibility of doing, read that memorandum as a document of the evil empire, or whatever you want to call it, and know that the alternative could indeed result in a future of real consequence and value and content and support for the greater good. So don't underestimate these plans. These plans change nations.
And let me
I actually want to highlight.
George, let me add something to that, Jack, before you jump in, because just fill in piece of our history, which you can also respond to. So we had a friend who saw that early on. And I don't remember the year, but I think it was even in the late 80s. And he researched at that point what the right had been doing from the Powell Memorandum and the kind of money, Zach, that you mentioned that they had put into infrastructure, not just young students, but think tanks and as well as future leaders. And he brought together all of the major political donors on the left from George Soros on down and founded an organization called the Democracy Alliance. And those of us, I think, here know who that was, an extraordinary man by the name of Rob Stein, who was a mentor to many of us and who passed away maybe 4 or 5 months ago. But a lot of the work we're doing, both on the progressive side, but also on the bridging side, because Rob was ultimately a bridger. And he saw, I think, as you guys are seeing, the long-term solution to this country are leaders across the board who put constitution and integrity above party and ideology, and put country and outcome above party and ideology. So there's a way in which what Rob did probably in his 50s has been a foundation upon which a lot of us have been working ever since. So I just wanted to put that in. He was a dear friend. There's a big hole and lots of hearts that this brilliant guy, who was also just full of love, is not with us at this point. But in you and Ramon and a lot of others, that kind of work really lives on.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, John. I had the good fortune of getting to know Rob over the last year, 2 years of his life, and I think there are a few people who I've known over such a short period of time who will leave such a lasting impact on me. I think similar to how you valued my presence in the room when we first met back in 2017, 2018. It was Rob's validation, affirmation of the work that we were doing that really has helped me keep going even through the challenging moments in this work, but also provide a guiding light towards what we can accomplish, but also how hard it is, because Rob got started some time ago, and we still have a lot of work to do. What I wanted to actually call out a quote that Rob actually highlighted in his last presentation, given only about, I think, four or 5 weeks ago to the Democracy Alliance. But the quote is from the Powell memo. And Lewis Powell says, "Strength lies in organization, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over an indefinite period of years, in the scale of financing available only through joint effort, and in the political power available only through united action and national organizations." I think that is one of the most important and powerful quotes that we could take away. And I want to emphasize, in careful long-range planning and implementation, in consistency of action over indefinite period of years. Because so often on the left, what we do is we invest in politics for a single cycle. We get out the vote for 2018. We invest in the infrastructure to just do the work for 2018 and then let it dissipate.
Oh,
We do the same for 2020 and then let it dissipate. And the reality is that, again, political power is not built overnight. It's not built via short injections of money. It's built via long-range planning and long-term investments that help us scale and sustain infrastructure and build that political power over time. But I also want to call out another point that I think has gone under discussed, but Rob had recognized in his last couple of years, and that is that the reality is the donor base on the left is actually to the left of where the Democratic Party is. Substantially to the left of where the Democratic Party is, where our base is. And by the way, where the base of Black and brown voters tend to be, where white working class voters are right now. And I think it's important to note that as we invest in and build this infrastructure, that infrastructure also needs to be attuned to where our base is right now. And so as an organization, we're focused primarily on swing districts and states, because that's where power is built. If you don't have governing majorities, you can't accomplish the big, bold, aspirational vision that I think many of us share for our country and our world. And I think it's important to acknowledge that given that many of us are privileged to have had a higher education experience and are quite educated people, and perhaps are surrounded by quite educated people, our country is increasingly polarized around educational experience. In 2012, the majority of educated Americans actually sided, I believe, with Mitt Romney for president. By 2016 and now 2020, educated Americans, highly educated Americans, are overwhelmingly supportive of the Democratic Party. And the most educated are also the most liberal donors. And the most liberal donors are donating to build infrastructure that is left of where the party is left of where the base is. And if we continue to invest and build to the left of where the party is and don't speak to the base of the party, we're not going to have the political power to achieve our aspirations. This is not a call for us to be more moderate. This is not a call for our politicians to be more moderate and less aspirational in their stances. It is for us to embrace diverse set of ideologies, diverse set of experiences, and recognize that in order to build political power, we need a bigger umbrella. We need a bigger tent approach. We need to build bridges in order to achieve the political power that will prevent anti-democratic, perhaps even fascist leadership from taking hold in our country. This is an urgent call because right now we are in a moment where there is still a threat of our previous president, anti-democratic president, being reelected, choosing to run and be reelected president. And we need to, for those who oppose that, we need to rally around opposing that force, whether it be through him or otherwise. And if we do not do it now, and if we do not build that bigger tent, and if we don't embrace the idea of having an infrastructure that isn't too far to the left, but rather is representative of where our power base is, where our voters are, we're going to lose those voters to an anti-democratic political infrastructure. And I will highlight this, I will feature this with data. The reality is that in our country right now, especially among those of lower education status, the value for democracy, the value against authoritarianism is diminishing, not just in the United States, but globally, because we have generations of folks who have now been raised in a democratic world and don't know the consequences of living in an undemocratic, authoritarian society. That's slipping away. And we cannot take this moment for granted. We cannot take the infrastructure, the institutions of democracy for granted. And at the same time, we have to recognize and value the fact that most of our critical voters, most of our base, they're not thinking about that. They're not thinking about democracy. They're thinking about putting food on the table no matter what it costs. They're thinking about paying for their healthcare no matter what political institution is in place. They're thinking about preventing their communities from dying from gun violence. Whether it's democracy or authoritarianism, they don't care. They just want the job done. And we need to be in a place now where we recognize that the job needs to get done, and getting the job done requires embracing a broad coalition of ideologies and of experiences, or else we'll lose the great experiment that we've now been building for nearly 250 years.
Zach, and just to touch in on that for a bit, I believe one of the reasons that the Powell Memorandum was so successful is that it had a priority, and its priority was to stop the encroachment on corporate rights and privileges of a rising liberal base. Unfortunately, I think we do not have a priority as a people trying to save democracy. We have not yet had sufficient education, sufficient correlation between the absence of democracy and its impact on food on the table, healthcare benefits, and the like. Because anyone that does a study of autocracies or totalitarian governments clearly see that food isn't always on the table, healthcare isn't available. And it seems to me that one of the things we could be doing a better job of is forming those correlations. What do you think?
I'll start, and then I want Ramon to pile in here. So much of politics is about how people feel. And so the expectation that people take the time to read those studies that you and I, and perhaps many folks on this chat have read, is impractical. It's perhaps even elitist to suggest that other Americans go read the studies and understand how authoritarianism impacts their lives. When right now, people don't feel good. They don't feel good about the state of our country. They don't feel great about the state of our world. And sometimes the impulse to a world where we don't feel good is to just try to change it. And I think it's incumbent upon us to acknowledge those feelings, to recognize where we've messed up, and to paint a vision and chart a path forward under new, bold, young leadership. Because, right now, I believe we never had a Gen X president. We've had like 3 or 4 baby boomer presidents. And, our generation's never seen anybody, or has rarely seen anybody in political leadership that makes them see someone who's speaking back to them and their lived experiences. I actually think about the January 6th hearing right now. It's highlighting some of the most fundamental, one of the greatest crises our country's ever faced, our democracy's ever faced. And the hearing is being run like it's the 1970s. Like everybody watches cable television. I can tell you with confidence, with certainty, I have not seen a single friend of mine who is under the age, I've seen one friend of mine who is under the age of 50 post about the January 6th hearings on their social media platform. I will tell you that people are posting about the fact that abortion is under threat, abortion rights are under threat. They're posting about the gun violence epidemic our country is facing, but nobody's talking about the January 6th hearings, because this idea of democracy is elitist. It's elitist in that, like, we care about it because we understand, we've read, we know the practical implications of a democracy versus authoritarianism. But we can't expect others to do the reading. We can't expect others to understand or see that. And frankly, even like suggesting that someone needs to understand something is a form of elitism and condescension. And that's part of what turned so many white voters who were in communities where there was lower education rates, and perhaps, not even perhaps, now it's also happening in lower education, where in communities with Black and brown voters who have lower education rates. That's part of why they're now turning against democracy. They're turning against us. And the same thing is happening with young people. And Ramon, I know you could speak to this throughout your own personal story as well.
Yeah, the truth is, I'm Gen Z, I'm 23 years old. And a lot of my younger friends are really progressive, left of the Democratic Party. And I consider myself a progressive, although my progressive friends wouldn't consider that. But that's because I recognize the reality of what families like mine, who are still, kind of living paycheck to paycheck, who are still trying to make it by every month, what they're focused on. My family, families like my family, people in my neighborhood, and I still grew up in public housing. I have not ever seen any of them bring up the January 6th committee hearings, or what happened on January 6th, or what Donald Trump is doing somewhere around the country, or he's endorsed, right? And the truth is, Republicans who support Trump have lost faith in the democratic process and political system and our government and country. And Democrats who are working class, who are Black and Latino, have lost faith in government too. This is something that a large majority of Americans share, and it's because the Democratic Party has strayed away from the dinner conversations about how are we going to afford rent at the end of the month, how are we going to pay off these credit cards, how are we going to divide up the grocery budget for this month. And these are conversations that Americans are having every day, that Black and Latinos are having every day, which is why we're seeing Latinos jump more to the Republican Party. But there are examples of why this is. 2019 cycle, at the height of activism and George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, it became the forefront of our party, an issue that was really carried by activists on the ground who just pushed this ideology that was honestly very privileged to defund the police. All right, that is something that Black and Latino communities would suffer the consequences for immediately with an increase of gun violence. And we saw the results of that. I'll give you two examples: Seattle and New York City. In Seattle, for the race for attorney for city attorney general, there was an abolitionist woman who was white and a Republican woman who was conservative, who was all about funding the police, and the abolitionist was about getting rid of police completely. In Seattle, when stuck between those two options, the Republican won, the first time ever, I believe, in the past like 40 to 30 years. In New York City, when we were faced with a primary, and New York City is considered one of the most progressive cities in the country, we elected Mayor Eric Adams, a Black mayor, the second Black mayor to ever hold the position, who grew up in poverty in Brownsville, who was a former police officer, and who supported funding the police because he knew the impacts that it would have on working class family if we elected a person that was privileged enough to have the ideology to think about things that the Democratic Party and the media is so focused on today. That being said, democracy is under attack, but I believe is more than just because Trump. I believe is because the party that is supposed to be for the working class people and the donor base behind that party is moving away from what the Democratic Party should be, is moving away from the people that they rely on swinging these elections, voters like myself, Black voters, and working class voters. And we're seeing this trend happen, all right, and it won't get better this cycle. It won't get better in 24 unless we make the right strategic and necessary investments, frankly, that the Next 50 is doing, right? And frankly, what the Next 50 is trying to do, not just with young voters and electing candidates, but also talking to these new donors and trying to get them involved and giving them what Republicans had done so strategically well 50 years ago, right? And laying out the blueprint of how we can do the same, but actually in a way where it can create a democracy that works. As Obama says, that can perfect our union. That's what's vital. That's what's missing from the Democratic Party. But we have a chance to really build a party that's inclusive to all working class people, to all people from different backgrounds, and to immigrants, people who are coming to this country looking for opportunity. We have a chance to really grab them and bring them part of our coalition.
Just a point of hope, though. I want to bring up a point of hope, and that is that in the Michigan State Senate, we had a special election about 6 to 8 weeks ago at this point. It was a district that Trump won by 14 points. Republicans nominated somebody who validated rape, who was anti-democracy. I mean, said some of the most ludicrous things. In a district that Trump won by 14 points, Democrats flipped that district only 2 months ago at the depths of Biden's approval ratings. And I say this because as much as we have work to do to get ourselves out of the gutter, they also are really deeply in the gutter, and they continue to support and elevate leaders who nobody wants to see in a position of power in this country. And we need to make sure that we call out the crazy where the crazy exists. We need to make sure that we elevate the competency and the vision that the Democratic Party and many of its leaders have right now for our country, because we do have an opportunity to win. But those opportunities, if we don't take advantage of them and we aren't smart and strategic about how we approach them, we'll let them slip away. And this is one of the most critical elections. And I know this is said often, but truthfully, like, the conditions for 2024 are going to be set in 2022 based on who's elected. The opportunity for fair and secure elections is going to be established in 2022. And I know you've had on here before Secretary of State Jenna Griswold from Colorado, who's been leading in some of that work at the Secretary of State level. This election could not matter more. And I find hope in the fact that people, young people in particular, have said they will step up and they will vote, despite a lack of enthusiasm. They will vote in the 2022 elections because they know how important that is. People aren't excited by this political moment, but they know how important it is. And fortunately, all of you are on this call and in this conversation because you recognize how important it is.
So Zach and Ramon, thank you. I have two questions. One relatively easy and one's a little bigger question. If you could advise the January 6th committee on how to reach young people, through social media. And I couldn't agree with you more. It's what it feels like we're watching the Watergate hearings all over again. What kind of advice would you give them on how to get the word out of how important this is to a constituency and a community that doesn't seem to be tuning in?
Well, I'll start off by saying I think there are a lot of amazing people on that committee. Some of the people are who've done the most to uphold our democracy. And the reality is that those people are not the most prevalent on the most engaged forms of media right now. They're not relevant, they're not young, and they're not commanding most of the airtime on cable news stations. So really, I would actually take a step back and reflect on who we chose to join that committee. And I think about how we shape it in a way that would actually capture the attention and energy of Americans of all different backgrounds. I think we could have done a better job there, but that's not here nor there. That's been done. Looking forward, we have to recognize that there are a lot of trusted sources and validators and influencers, so to speak, who connect to a lot of different communities across this country. And we need to deploy that influencer network across the country. And when I say influencer, they could be political influencers, social influencers, whatever they may be, and need to make sure that they're leveraging their platforms to tell the story of January 6th. We need to make sure there's a coordinated effort across the country of people with platforms who care about the future of our democracy, who care about defeating all that Trumpism represents, telling this story. And telling this story through different mediums. It's not elevating the hearings per se, it's elevating the stories being told during those hearings. If you watch the videos during those hearings, you could not possibly walk away not believing that that was one of the most treasonous, anti-democratic moments in our country's history.
So maybe what we need, Zach, is a next 50 division that somehow or another creates a whole army of translators who speak, and you know what a transponder is, it aggregates and then it communicates. So I just feel that committee is doing an outstanding job for who they are. And unfortunately, there are not more 23-year-olds and 25-year-olds or 30-year-olds who are as sophisticated in social media. And actually, that should be the business of the Democratic Party at the moment, to be providing that resource. But maybe the next 50 could consider starting a new division that could help make that a reality. I also want to say to you, because it was important when both you and Ramon talked about issues and feelings. And I think that those are two absolutely critical understandings that the political process lacks. But I also want to point out that very few people who support the Republican agenda today have ever read the Powell Memorandum. The gift that the Republican Party has given to that initiative is they have found translators. They have been able to reduce the studies into practical policies and feelings and whatnot. And that's something I agree we could pay a lot more attention to.
So Ramon, just also a response. George, that's a good point. Zach, I want to underline the challenge to the next 50, because I think what you're saying and George saying is we still have time. There still is time. And it might not take a lot, given your network, to frame some tweets, to frame the social media platform that would allow many people to do this, including, I have no idea what Vice Media is doing in this regard, given their megaphone to younger people. But Ramon, over to you for a minute. How are you holding us? And then I want to take the conversation in a little different direction.
Well, there's one Black person on the January 6th committee, which to me is absurd, right? Because how to get people to care about the January 6th hearings, right? People already do, but what happened on January 6th is a voting rights issue, right? It's what John Lewis Martin Luther King, the Black civil rights leaders that we hold to high regards today. It's what they marched for. It's what they fought for. It's what we march for today, right? When we're going out there and fighting for people's rights to vote. But the truth is, the committee doesn't represent, right, the voting rights movement in America. At the end of the day, I believe what happened on January 6th is fundamentally a voting rights issue in America. And I don't think that if young people are listening to the hearings now, it's because they don't relate to it. When an issue to that, January 6th has a big megaphone already, right? And we have the abortion movement and the gun violence movement and the climate movement, right? That young people are all behind, right? So if young people aren't behind in tuning into the January 6th hearings, then they won't be in tune to what it currently is. But they'll be in tune to marching in the streets for voting rights, to marching in the street to ensure that young people can vote, that we pass early voting, right, in multiple states, that we automatically register 18-year-olds to vote when they turn 18, right? There are certain initiatives that Democrats, and quite frankly, not even Democrats, just legislators in general, can elevate through the January 6th hearings that are fundamental to our democracy, which is voting rights. And we have tried to get voting rights passed in the Senate, and it has failed, right? Which is why we need to make the necessary investments and elect young people, right? And invest in the necessary races to make sure that we can flip these states and flip these districts to allow us to be able to pass these initiatives. But really, if I were to give them any piece of advice, I'd say young people will not care about what happened on January 6th, but they will care about what happens moving forward, and that's whether or not they will have a right to vote, whether they will have a planet they care a planet they care about that's still there to live in, whether they don't have to be scared to go to school or a concert or a movie theater, or whether or not they actually have a country in which they feel included, in which they feel they are active members of, right? And that's through their right to vote. If young people feel like their votes are being translated to an agenda that makes their country better, that makes tomorrow better for them, they will not engage in the hyper politics that Washington is producing. And the reality is, the January 6th is an example of hyper politics, where it's just two parties going back to back. Even though it's vital to the future of democracy, people are exhausted of politics. People want action.
Very well said. And I would just add, if there's a way of conflating January 6th and voting rights, if you guys do choose to try to help move this whole thing into social media, I think you framed it very well, Ramon. Zach, you wanted to say something, and then let me follow up with a different direction here.
Yeah, I struggle with the whole voting rights push, perhaps more than most. Not because I don't believe in it. It's very hard working in politics to be able to delineate between your values and what you really want to achieve and your aspirations, and how others are feeling and what's practical to achieve. Because if we set the wrong expectations for our base and we underdeliver, then they start to not believe in us anymore, in our ability to accomplish things. And the reality is, when we passed the Affordable Care Act, when Obama passed the Affordable Care Act, we had, I think, 60 senators. We had senators in Alaska, Missouri, Arkansas, Florida, West Virginia, 2 in West Virginia, actually, although one was Robert Byrd. I think the point is made. We had senators in places we no longer even dream of competing in. And right now we've set these expectations for what we could accomplish, when in reality, we knew we couldn't accomplish those things because we didn't have the votes. And we spent a lot of time and political capital, both in Washington and with our voters, on trying to achieve something that, truth be told, out of Georgia, was not a priority issue for American voters. Yeah, voting rights was not a priority issue for American voters outside of Georgia. And yet that became the #1 priority for Democrats this year, early on this year. And I struggle with this because we need to keep the fight going. We need to make sure that we have secure and fair elections. but we also need to be attuned to what our base wants and what our base is speaking to. And truth be told, as much as Ramon and I spend time on Twitter, the base is not on Twitter. Base is absolutely not on
Let
Twitter.
me-
If
let me
the base was
follow
on
up.
Twitter, Elizabeth Warren would be president right now.
Or Bernie. So let me follow up on that because I think it's really important. You're using the frame our base, you're using the phrase we, and you're basically saying Democratic Party.
Yes,
So here's my challenge.
yes,
My belief is that there's a new constituency out there that are Democrats, Republicans, disaffected Democrats and Republicans. There's so many voters out there in the moderate center who say PACs on both your houses, and independents and people who don't vote for the reason that they don't think their vote makes a difference. So in the spirit of the next 50, A, how many Republicans are you supporting? But B, my belief is that unless we can pull together a constituency that includes the folks that I've mentioned, we are going to continue not having enough votes to do much of anything. And I'm not talking about a third party. I'm talking about a constituency that supports leaders who put country and constitution in front of party and ideology, regardless of their base, and puts the common good in front of their base. And my belief is that that's a majority of Americans, because we know how many Americans agree on things. The polling is pretty strong. The other side is, I don't think you want to do a third party until it can be a first party. And I happen to believe with a kind of organizing that would be required, there's a new first party in this country that may not show up for 5 or 10 years, but there's some exploration that doesn't want to happen until after 2022 election. Because at this point, to me, it is about electing Democrats. In the long run, it's about electing sane, sensible, pragmatic Americans who represent the whole. So I'd love to hear how you hold this creative tension, because I personally call myself a transpartisan progressive. But in the long run, in my bones, I know that where we're going has to be a whole lot more inclusive than where we are.
I'll tell a story, a brief political story. There's one state in the country right now that voted for Trump in 2020 that is a state legislative majority held by Democrats in one state legislative body. It's Alaska. The reason Alaska has a state legislative body that's controlled by Democrats is because there are a handful of Republicans who choose to caucus with the Democratic Party. And that is, I guess, John, by your definition, transpartisan. Is it bipartisan? It's transpartisan. We'll go with that,
Or
right?
we can call it cross-partisan, which is what most
Cross-partisan.
people do.
And I think that the next 50 doesn't use the label or term progressive. We rarely use the term Democrat. The reason being is it's such a loaded term. What it takes to be elected to office in Queens, in New York or Los Angeles is very different than what it takes to be elected to office in Alaska, in Colorado, in Montana, et cetera. And these labels carry so much baggage. And what's interesting is if you think about these Republicans who are caucusing with the Democratic Party, functionally they actually might be Democrats, but the label Democrat carries too much baggage in their district for them to run as Democrats. So they're running as Republicans. And sure, they differ from the Democratic Party on a subset of issues, but there are a handful of things that they can rally around and agree upon. One is obviously protecting our elections, securing our democracy. The other is expanding Medicaid access. Another may be, addressing our climate crisis, although the measures by which we address the climate crisis may vary. And so I think it's interesting to think through how a lot of labels carry a lot of baggage. I think in the early 2000s, the late 90s, the term liberal was basically what progressive is now. And now, oh my God, you never want to use the word liberal or you might lose an election. Now it perhaps is progressive, but truth be told, it really depends on the community, the constituency that you're in and that you're serving. And I think we have to take this wider lens toward how do we build political coalition? How do we build political power?
Oh.
And another place where this is happening right now, and we'll see whether or not it succeeds, is Utah. Evan McMullin ran for president in 2016 as an independent, although basically a Republican-leaning independent, and now chose to step up and run for Senate in Utah as an independent again.
Yeah.
The Democratic Party realized in Utah that they never stood a chance of winning a race. And our democracy would be healthier if an independent, although a Republican-leaning independent, and Evan McMullin was elected to the U.S. Senate than the incumbent Mike Lee. And so this is not necessarily exactly what the Next 50 is engaging on, but as we introduce this next generation of donors to political giving, I think it's important for people who are giving their time, energy, resources to politics to think through the construct of how do we build political power? How are we pragmatic about how we build political power? How do we make the right investments to build political power? And for us at the Next 50, as we invest in leaders, we also want to make sure that as we build political power, we're not building political power among the same people, typically people who look like me, who've been in power for the last 50, 100, 250 years. We need to make sure that there are resources injected into people and communities that otherwise are under-resourced, because we know that those who outperform the one candidate who tends to outperform fundamentals more than anybody else that I could think of in this country is Congresswoman Lucy McBath in Georgia. She ran in the same district that John Ossoff ran for Congress in back in a special election in 2017, I believe. John Ossoff received, I think, $80 million in that special election, and he lost to Karen Handel, I think. Fast forward 2018, I'm sorry. Lucy McBath, a Black woman who lost her son to gun violence, runs for election, raises $20 million, wins the race. Now she just won re-election. A big part of that is because of who she is, what her story is, and because we elevated someone, we invested in somebody who usually doesn't have the opportunity to have the political power that she now has. And we had to invest less in her to win her race than John Ossoff ran, but and needed investment in to lose his race. And so I think just shifting the construct around how we invest in political leadership is really important, because we need to get creative to build political power. We can't just invest in the traditional same old Democrats to build the power that's going to allow us to protect our democracy.
Ramon, over to you.
I mean, I really piggyback off of everything what Zach just said. It was pretty spot on. I mean, yeah. I don't think I have anything more to add to that.
So, George, let me ask you something here. We have somebody waiting in the wings who himself, and you're on mute, you may know, who ran for political office when he was a relatively young man. And I'm just wondering whether it may be time to bring him into this conversation.
I think it is. Just before Jim comes in, I just want to make a point that while the meat of this conversation is talking about what is currently possible at a local level or a state level in the United States, I don't see a hair's breadth of possibility being demonstrated by McConnell and his team in the Senate, or by the Republicans in Congress to show up in a transpartisan or cross-partisan way. I think you're building a future when you talk about that, which is clearly part of the goal of the Next 50. But right now, our challenge is we have a group of people in office, in control of our federal government's ability to proceed, and they don't have one hair on their head, in my opinion, that looks for collaboration, cooperation, and the greater good. So while we're paying attention to the future, I think we have to start developing a much more rigorous policy for the present, or we are going to stay in this gridlock for some time. And for me, the key to that is we the people. We the people, whether they're interested or not, need to get more involved in expressing their desire to break the gridlock in Washington while we build a future.
And thank you, George. And I just want to acknowledge, for those of you who are still watching or listening out there, that this is a bunch of men today. It's not always that way. In fact, if you tune in later this week, we'll have a bunch of women. But by and large, historically and present-wise, women are much better collaborators and cooperators and alliance builders and partnership makers than we men are. And I think what's interesting with younger people in your generation is that younger men are better at that than older men have been. So I just want to acknowledge that in terms of what this looks like and who we are. But I also want to acknowledge that it's easy to take it on when they're just men on stage, but we all have a masculine and a feminine side to us. And for those of us who may have tuned out because there aren't any women here or wish there were more women, I agree today, but each panel is different and it's not always like this. So just a bow to the obvious.
Thank you
Jim-
for that, John. I'll just call out 70% of the leaders that we're backing this cycle are women.
Yeah.
And I think most of the people who are investing their financial resources in our work are also women.
Oh,
So although they're not vocally present in this conversation, I don't think this work would be possible without them. So thank you for calling.
So
that
let's
out.
bring another older white guy to join us with white hair. So Jim Garrison, how old were you when you ran for Congress?
Oh boy, I was in my early 30s.
That was yesterday, last year.
Thanks, Zach.
It was a great experience for sure. What I wanted to bring in, since we've been talking about the Powell memo, is an aspect that I think is, in my view, critically important to understand, that there was a context to the Powell memo, and that was the Nixon Southern strategy. And as John Ehrlichman, his chief of staff, put it, it was a fusion of law and order and racism to cater to the Southern white demographic, which up to that point had been basically Democratic as opposed to Republican. And because of the Southern strategy, the Republicans took hold of the Southern states and have been building both the tactics of a Lewis Powell strategy, Zach, as you articulated, as well as George, but it's been within the strategic ethos of increasingly overt racism, increasingly overt xenophobia, increasingly overt anti-women policy formations, and most explicitly, the notion that the Democratic strategy of bringing in immigrants and empowering young people and people of color is a threat to the capacity of the Republicans to maintain power, even though their demographic is shrinking, so that the net result is a sabotaging of the democratic process itself, purely and cynically to maintain power. So when you see the attack on Roe v. Wade, when you see the attack on people of color, then you see the manipulation of January 6th as somehow the machinations of Antifa or Black Lives Matter. It's part of a larger culture war that is gaining momentum because linked with the Powell strategy, they've simultaneously over the last 50 years, as you pointed out, Zach, have systematically empowered young people, systematically packed the courts, till now it's basically virtually game over. And we're looking at this last gasp, in November of 2022, which, if it doesn't go well, may mean that, like climate change and a number of other global issues, it's now too late. So I wanted to bring this in because I think it's very important that progressives not be in a fantasy that, well, we may lose this election, but we can be transpartisan and we may pick up a seat here and there. That's true. But the mega trend that has been shaping American politics, as I view it, as someone who ran for office and has been deeply involved, is a mega trend that the Democratic Party hasn't even understood, let alone had a strategic formation to counter. So as I'm viewing it, and would love to, be corrected if I'm wrong in any way, because it's a pretty pessimistic view of things. The situation in which we find ourselves is not accidental. Trump was not an accidental president. And what's happening with Roe v. Wade is not accidental. It's a strategic unfoldment of something that has been culturally, politically, tactically orchestrated with a view of collapsing democracy as we know it, because a viable democracy means that the Republicans lose, and they're not willing to do that. So I just love to hear your responses, because you're obviously closer to the ground than I am. But it feels like we're definitely in code red.
I often say, this is like partially a morbid, but I mean this to be in a positive light. I say this as a Jew. We can say as Jews that there is brightness on the other side of the darkness, right? And right now may be a dark moment. But there is work that we can do to achieve that light, that brightness sooner rather than later. I often draw historical equivalencies to this moment, in both one in a global context and another in a domestic context. I'll start with the global one. In the early 20th century, you saw the fall of the dynasties. And what happened after the dynasties fell was that there was this brief institution of democracy across Europe. And the democracies were so weak that people craved strongman leadership. And that's what led to the rise in authoritarianism across Europe. And we know what happened then. There was a demise there. And then there's a more domestic analogy, which was actually, I think touches upon what you were saying, Jim, which is, I think, the end of Nixon. You saw Jimmy Carter become president. We know what happened then. There are a lot of historical parallels between the Carter presidency and what we're facing in our country right now. And then we saw the longest term of single party leadership our country had seen since FDR with the Reagan-Bush years. And I think there is a scenario where we're on the cusp of another Reagan-Bush era. But there's a lot that we can do in the next 2 years, learning from historical precedent to prevent that. But we have to learn from historical precedent. We have to apply our learnings from historical precedent to address and shape this moment. And then the other thing that I think is completely different than those two eras is that we're actually dealing with people that the public sees as certifiably crazy. Those people are gaining positions of political power. 2020 was an election, was a referendum on the craziness. People still don't want the craziness in power. And I think we have an opportunity to prevent the craziness from being elected to power. I don't think that 2022, by any stretch of the means, is the end of democracy if we don't completely succeed. I think about people, I don't agree with them 90% of the time, but like Lisa Murkowski, like Mitt Romney, like Susan Collins. If those people are the difference, the margin in the US Senate, and then there are people like that who are the margin in the US House, we do have a governing majority that cares about democracy. And we have a very strong likelihood of maintaining that governing majority going into 2024. That cares about democracy. I know there are a lot of other issues at stake, but that these people do care about preserving our democracy. And I think like there is reason for hope because we've won in 2020. We won and we flipped that Michigan State Senate seat. just a couple months ago when Democrats were in the worst position that they've been in. The fact that we flipped a seat in Michigan, like there is opportunity here that we can't let go by the wayside.
So you take the position that even if 2022 midterms are catastrophic for Democrats and the progressives, that is just a repeat of an old political pattern where the pendulum is just basically swinging to the right, but that there's nothing institutionally wrong with the process itself. This is just a pendulum swing.
You know, voting rights in New York are worse than they are in Georgia right now, but yet we keep talking about voting rights in Georgia. Like the ability to access the polls in New York is absurd. The lines that you have in New York are absurd, but the reason we don't talk about it is because it's a blue state. And so I think, you know, to be fatalistic about the state of our democracy is to also not be introspective about our own flaws. We have work as a pro-democracy coalition to do, to recognize.
No, it wasn't, Zach, I wasn't being fatalistic. What I was trying to bring out is that the Lewis Powell strategy
Yes.
worked as effectively as it did because it was enveloped in a cultural strategy.
Yes. And who better to, by the way, to build a cultural strategy than a movement like ours that has so much access to media outlets and influencers. That's why the whole January 6th, the failure of the January 6th hearing to really permeate the national narrative is quite a loss on our part. And also, I don't mean to impose the fatalistic outlook on you, but rather I think a lot of people could hear this conversation and feel like, oh, doom, like, you know, doom is coming, gloom is here. And I don't think that that's quite it. The work is hard. It's not exciting. And many people here have been doing this longer than I have. So it's not, but the importance of this moment is not to be understated. And, you know, you mentioned 50 years ago, the Powell memo was written. 50 years ago, also Roe v. Wade came into effect. And now we see this full circle moment coming in our country where the effects on the court are now going to be quite apparent to most Americans. Maybe not the most inspiring way for me to start to close this, but only a couple months ago, of 26 issues polled, the 26th most important issue to Americans was the issue of abortion. After the memo leak took place, it went up to 12. When the actual decision comes out, should it be anywhere reflective of the actual leak, that will only rise. And what is not stated within that ranking is the impact that has on the perspective or the importance of these issues to specific demographics. And we know that women, actually white women, have immense political power in swing districts and states across our country. And so my hope is that in this dark moment, that will be a culmination of so much that conservatives have done for 50 years. People will recognize the importance of exercising their political power and recognize the importance of this specific political moment towards shaping the future of our democracy. It's almost a restart, a refresh moment for us. And I think that the issue perhaps will be salient. I actually want to characterize this within the top 5 most important issues. So the top 4 most important issues are the economy, inflation, jobs, and crime. This is the first time since the 1970s that crime was above healthcare as an issue of importance. And I think the abortion issue will help resurface healthcare and issues that are favorable to Democrats as a top issue. Abortion is the only issue among all 26 issues where Democrats have the most trust. And all it takes is moving the needle on one specific issue that moves a particular demographic as a voting issue for us to win elections in 2022 and then reshape the narrative for 2024. So I carry some level of hope.
Zach, since you brought it up,
George, let's bring
I'd
Ramon.
like to hear what Ramon has to say
sure,
on
by all
this too.
means, Ramon.
I just want to share a story because I think we're in tough times right now, but I don't think that you know, we should lose hope or we should feel worried about the future. So when in 2018, after I had done my march in New York, I joined a Parkland student, and we did a tour around the country. And our first stop was in Houston, Texas. And we're a bunch of young people, fresh out of high school. Some of us, early on our college careers. And we get to the city hall in Houston. And we start, rallying, giving speeches. It's a big crowd. And then 10 minutes later, trucks and cars of guys with Trump flags and AR-15s get out and start protesting at us across the street, yelling at us. Like, these are grown men with guns yelling at teenagers. And coming from New York and never having been to Texas or travel much to this, the country at all, that was a big shock to me. But what me and some of my peers did, we went and we crossed the street, and we spoke to some of the gentlemen with the AR-15s who were yelling at us. And I met one man in particular who was there with his son. He had an AR-15 and he had a pistol on his leg. And his son also had a gun. I'm pretty sure his son was like 14 or 15. But this man was clearly angry. But I went up to him, I shook his hand, and I told him I just wanted to know why he was here. I wanted to put politics aside. I told him about the story of my friend that I had lost to gun violence. And he told me about how he used to be a police officer in the Houston area and why he joined the force and why he had guns at home and why he believed guns was the best way to protect his family. What we agreed on was that we both wanted the same thing, right? Was to keep our loved ones safe, right? Was to make sure that we felt secure and safe in a country where there's crime and violence, right? And where, unfortunately, we have mass shootings. Through that conversation, we got to know a lot about each other. And by the end of it, we took a selfie, we hugged, right? And we exchanged numbers. And for the rest of that summer, when I encounter another counter protester who is, crazy with the AR-15, I would text him and I would ask him, how do I approach this? Me and this individual, we ended up agreeing on pretty much every single common sense gun policy that I had been advocating for that summer and what we're still advocating for today. And this is a guy who came here with a MAGA flag, who was an AR-15, Second Amendment loving American. And yet we came together, we agreed on stuff, we put politics aside, and we were able to find a common ground and create that bridge, right, that most Americans are at right now. I don't think, right, in that same summer, I want to add, we young people will increase their voter turnout by 37%, which was the largest in any non-presidential midterm election in our country. And we were able to gain the majority, right, in Congress, which led to us passing gun laws that now still sit in Congress, right? And we need to do the same with the Senate. That being said, I don't believe that we're in a terrible position. I do believe that young people care. I believe that Americans care. And I believe when it actually comes to it, young people and Americans will come out to vote. We saw it in New York, right? Where working class people, white working class people, Black and Latinos, right, build a diverse coalition, right, around a Black mayor who isn't a progressive, right? Who some call progressive, some call Republican, and some call moderate. He's everything, right? Because he campaigned on the issues that matter. And I think as the party continues to develop, as we continue to transform into the party that represents the people in this country and over a majority, and not just Democrats, but also Republicans, I don't think that the Republican Party is at its core right now. I don't think that what Trump is representing is what most Republicans or Americans are. I think there can be a political system where Republicans and Democrats can work together. We've seen it. There's examples around the country, like Zach said in Alaska. I think it's going to take us coming out, us voting, us really being activated, us having the conversations that matter, and having those and crossing the street like I did in Houston, Texas, and having these conversations that matter. We agree, right? The people will prevail against any sort of injustice, against any sort of hyper political commentary that distracts us from the real issues, right, that we care about. And I think that we get distracted a lot, but I think we often get reminded that we will prevail. And it's hard to believe that. It's hard when we look at history, when we see history continuing to repeat itself. right? But it's up to us to make that new history. It's up to us, right, to charter and build that new generation of leaders, that have representation that we believe can create a new history, right, that can break the cycle that we've seen repeatedly. And this is the time to do it. More than ever, we're connected. We're on a Zoom call right now. If it weren't for the Zoom, I would have probably never been speaking to many of the people today. I wouldn't have met John or George or even you, Jim. And we are more connected than ever. We have the tools that in the past, those who fought for democracy didn't have. And I believe that those who want to destroy democracy have these same tools, but the people, right, are the majority, and the people will prevail. The people want a country that works for them, want a country where they feel heard and represented.
And one of the tools, Ramon, that we have was a documentary made about the Parkland kids that you may have been part of, called Us Kids.
Yeah.
Which I don't know whether they captured that same conversation you had, but I seem to have a recollection that it might have been in there or something like it. And again, I just want to say to our audience, Us Kids is an amazing documentary that gets at the heart of really what you're saying and the inspiration and hope that you all bring to our country.
So first of all, Ramon, thank you very much for that clarity and that heartfelt expression. And Zach, you too, for all of your commitment to the light and to hope and to possibility. I will keep nudging you, since you're a former Facebooker, that I know your plate's really full, Zach, and that going ahead, you have a ton of work to do, and I want to celebrate and support that. And perhaps taking 20 minutes or 30 minutes once in a while and calling like-minded young people like yourself and saying, what could we do to take this translation of the January 6th committee and make it more relevant, more palatable, more understandable and acceptable, could be a gift of extraordinary value.
Oh.
So I just encourage that as a possibility. And Jim, I think we're ready to wrap up. Is that true from your standpoint?
Yeah, thank you. George, why don't you say a quick word about tomorrow?
Well, John and I will be back tomorrow, and
Two old white guys having a good time together.
yeah, well, we've been doing it for 35 or 40 years. Why not continue it, you know? So tomorrow we're talking about democracy's future and the state of the states. So in addition to Stephen, Olakara, Eleanor LeCain, and maybe some surprise guests, we'll be talking about what is going on in the states and how critical that idea is of what happens to elections, who verifies and certifies votes, and all of that kind of thing. So
and the importance of the secretaries of state.
Yep. So we look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Jim, take us out, will you?
Thank you, George. Thank you, John, for convening this session today. And Zach and Ramon, I can't tell you how inspiring you've been. It's we're in a very dark place in American history. There's no doubt about it. And the fact that the two of you and your compatriots can still stay in the trenches 24/7, 365 with the kind of fortitude and perseverance and determination is really what democracy is all about. You're exemplifying democracy in action. So I just want to acknowledge that and to say that your hope has been infectious, I think, on all of us today. And we look forward to supporting you in any way. The gun control issue, Ramon, is critical and urgent. And the issue of getting young people and looking over the next 50 years, Zach, is equally urgent and critical, because democracy, generation by generation, has to be protected and revitalized to ensure its ongoing capacity to serve the will of the people. So I want to thank both of you very much for your leadership at this time in American history. Thank you, everyone. That'll do it for us for today. You're all welcome to the after session chat group. If you'd like to join, the link is in the chat box. And we'll see the rest of you tomorrow, same time, same station, for day 2 of a 5-day program on the crisis and challenge of democracy in the United States. Bye for now.